this talk that I'm going to give, I originally gave it about 5 years ago for the Organization of American Historians. I'm part of a national organization called the Women's Collaborative for History. And our main focus is to make sure that women are being interpreted in our historic sites. And I think all of you probably realize that, except for the wonderful people that come to Renaissance Society, a lot of people don't learn history after they get out of school, except by going to historic sites. And it's really, really important that we tell a balanced story in that. So I'm on the Research and Interpretation Committee. And so that is our really big objective, is to talk about women and to tell the broader story, not just about women, but about all people that are part of our history. And I wanted to put this up here because, and I told Sigrid, who invited me to do this, that it's going to be a little political because history is under attack right now. And so we need to, why is history important? And it's important because it teaches us critical thinking. Historians, we don't look at something and go, okay, that's it. We go, okay, where did that come from? Why do we know that's true? What is the evidence that shows this to be true? And if we can do anything, if we can teach our children to be critical thinkers, then we've succeeded in a really great way. But that's an important part of history. The other thing that it does is it fosters empathy by exposing us to diverse experiences. And that's why it's really important to tell these broader stories, because there isn't just one story. When I worked on the Vietnam exhibit, the one thing I talked to about 40 people that had all been at Cal during all these protests, and they all saw it differently. So there isn't one story. There are many, many stories, and it's important for us to get as many of those out and understand that different events affect people differently. And then it's developing civic responsibility. When we understand our history and the things that have happened in the past, we're more likely to contribute and participate in that. And then it's also about resilience. When we learn what other people went through, and particularly when I talk about women in the gold rush, they went through a lot. And it was not easy. This was not an easy place to live. So try imagining living here with 3 layers of skirts on and the heat in the summer. And they had a really bad situation with mosquitoes early on. All of those things. They had flooding, they had fires. So it was not an easy place to live. But history teaches us those things. So that's my little preface. And then the other thing that I want to is this quote that I have up here. Several persons have been taken up within these few days by the soldiers and confined without warrant. Do you know what that's from? Revolutionary War. That's from 1766. And the Bostonians were complaining because the English were putting troops on their streets. And they sent the message that we have a good life here. We live peacefully and you're destroying it. So think about that. History repeats itself, and we need to learn and remember those lessons from the past. Am I out of the film? I'm really bad about staying in place. So my talk, women's place in history. And I have this. This is actually a refrigerator magnet that I have on my refrigerator because it's true. For most of history, Anonymous was a woman. And the reason for that is because who recorded history? Men. And they never talked about the women. And even when I started off at the Oakland Museum and all these historians were coming in and out, and I would say, well, what about the women? And they would say they were prostitutes, but there really weren't that many of them here. And so I walked out on a presentation, and my friend Kathy was you were there when Jim Holliday was there. He's the one that said that. And he followed me into my office and he said, why did you leave? You were mad. And I said, because you're wrong. And he, to his credit, he sat there, he listened to me, and we talked about it. And he said, you've made me think about this in a different way. So give him a lot of credit for that. But they have been left out. And one of the things that's really interesting is we did not have female historians who were trained historians in this country until the 1950s. So think about what's been left out up to that point. How do I get this to move? Okay. So just to do a broad spectrum of women in California. So this is Pio Pico and his family. And this is a daguerreotype from Silver and Gold. So there I did get it in. This is a very early daguerreotype from probably the 1840s. And I put it in because the Spanish were here, and there were women here that were living very productive lives as in this society. The other thing is that's really interesting is when the Spanish came in to settle, they sent in men. Okay, they sent in on the southern California area. They sent them in without women, and the men wrote back and said, "You better send women, or we're not staying." So they begged, and there's correspondence going back and forth saying, please send more women. And they would send them in groups out because they knew in order to get the men to stay and settle, they need to have women there too. So that's kind of a really early on of the significance of women. And then my main focus was to talk about women and how they contributed to the economic development of Sacramento. But they contributed in a lot of ways. And they were present, and they were landowners, they were business owners, and they were innovators that have not been given credit. And the thing that I found really interesting, when you research them and you're trying to find them, oftentimes they didn't put their first names in. They only listed their initials. So for businesses and so forth, it would just be their initials and their last name. And there was an assumption made by people that they were all men, and they weren't. And so that's kind of an interesting part of doing this research is really finding out who the women are. And then as you go through the assessor books and so forth and seeing how much property they owned and how much they controlled is really interesting. So another thing that I have two friends here who heard me say this on Sunday, but one of the things that's so interesting about California versus the rest of the United States, particularly the East Coast, Boston and so forth, those areas are all based on English law. California is based on Spanish law. And the big difference between Spanish law and English law are the laws of inheritance. In the East, women could not inherit their husband's property. It would go to the first male heir. In California, they did. So there are opportunities here that didn't exist if you came from back east. And many of the women, and I've read so many journal entries and descriptions, they treasured the freedoms and the opportunities that they had when they came here. And a lot of them got divorces too, which was really interesting. Divorce laws were more lenient here. So let me start with the first. I want to recognize the Native women that were here because they were here, and oftentimes they're not recognized at all. And the Native Americans were here in the Sacramento region. They were up and down the rivers all around here for over 1,000 years and living. They were always diverse. So there were multiple tribes. Sometimes they spoke different languages and they had cultural differences, but they lived peacefully. That's the thing that was always interesting to me. The first Anglo women that arrived at Sutter's Fort came on October 19th, 1841, and that was Mary Walker with her husband, Joel P. Walker. I don't have any pictures of her, but one of the things that I wanted to talk about with this is women worked at Sutter's Fort. The Native American women and the men all worked at Sutter's Fort. And the conditions for them weren't that great at Sutter's Fort. So Sutter takes advantage of the fact that he is the highest ranking official in this land, which was his new kingdom. And he gave himself permission, which he did, to cohabitate with several women. He brought one woman with him from the Sandwich Islands that was a Kanaka, and he lived with her for a period of time. Now, keep in mind, he was married. He had children back in Austria, and he pretty much deserted them, and when he left, he ended up, they went broke, and his wife sent their son out to find him, because he wasn't sending any money back or anything, but Sutter's a whole nother story, and I'm not going to go there. Anyway, so that was in 1853 when he brought the woman back from Hawaii, and according to his overseer, Leinhard, Sutter was also intimately involved with Indian women and had a special room next to his chambers where a large number of Indian girls were constantly at his beck and call. Leinhard also noted that Sutter had sexual relations with girls as young as 10 who became ill and died of neglect after he banished them from the fort. Leinhard said of one of these unions produced a child. That eventually died. Records from 1846 show that 10 mixed raced children at New Helvetia and Sutter's Fort, where the fathers are totally unidentified. So these could have been from Sutter, or they could have been from any man at the fort. So I think we can generally say that Native women worked at Sutter's Fort. So when we talk about basically white immigration or immigration during the gold rush era, women coming to California. So I have the harbor master records from 1850, and you can see the difference: 35,333 men and 1,248 women. Okay, and on the Overland Trail, you've got 39,560 men, you've got 1,248 women, and then 609 children. The numbers are staggering, okay, but this is 1850. Just 2 years later, those numbers start to change. Now, it would be a long time, and actually not until the 1960s did women have as high of a population as men in California. So that's a long time. But they were dominant, and at times in Sacramento in particular, because it was seasonal. So men would be here in the winter months when they couldn't gold pan up in the mountains. So it could be as much as 10 men for every one woman, and which gives you an idea of kind of what it was like here. So women were a novelty, and in many ways, and in some ways that gave them an advantage. So we look at this as the census records from 1850, the female population, and then you look at how it goes up in 1860. Okay, so, and then 1870, 210. They're starting to catch up. And then by 1880, they're more than half. And then 1890, they're again have raised up even more. So they're coming in regularly. One of the things that's really interesting is that by 1852, it wasn't single men coming here, it was families. But one of the things that I've found in my research is that oftentimes the women came on their own with their children while the husbands were out here. Now, they were traveling with small children. One woman, I have one record of her giving birth on the way, and the child died. And so the husband never was able to see the baby. But who had a harder time traveling across country, I would like to ask, because I think the women taking care of all the children and so forth was very difficult. But I will say, in the accounts that I've read, most of them loved it. I mean, they talked about how they would ride on a horse, and they felt the freedom of being able to ride on the horse in the plains, and they talked about how this was an adventure for them. Now, you have to remember, they're coming from the East Coast with all of these rules, so many rules, the Puritan style of life, everything that this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. And so many of them talk about the freedom that they felt when they got here. And one of my favorite quotes, it's from a book that's the letters of Jenny McGuire. It's at the Huntington Library, and there's a book called An Apron Full of Gold. And she writes to her daughter, "The air is even freer here." And so it was great. And then one of my favorite, another quote, Bayard Taylor, have any of you heard of him? He was here from the New York newspaper. He was here in 49, and he was in Sacramento, described it. And he described people coming off the trail. And he said the women fared much better than the men did. So the other thing that, and this is Mary Jane McGuire, again, her book is great, and she's such an independent woman. My favorite thing about her is that she liked it here so much better, and that her husband didn't like it, and he made her come. She didn't want to leave her children. He made her come, and she fell in love with California. She left him and came back here because he wanted to go back, but she left him and stayed there and stayed here. So this is a range of different women and different experiences. Women, this is a classic daguerreotype from the Gold Rush era of a woman bringing food to the mines. But all of the different women that were coming here, and particularly in 1850s, slavery was still intact, and women were brought here against their will, and especially Chinese women were brought here against their will and put into prostitution really early on. So one of the economic ways that women built this was through prostitution, the unconventional entrepreneurs. overall statistical analysis of prostitution in Sacramento, there was a lot of prostitution in Sacramento. Wherever you have politicians, you have prostitutes. It's a fact. Go to any state capital, capital of the United States, you're going to find a lot of prostitutes. 28% of all females in the first ward. So the first ward would have been where Old Sac is, that's the first ward. And then it goes out from there, second, third. But right along the waterfront, 28% of the first ward were prostitutes. 5% of all females in second ward were prostitutes. 14% of all females in both wards combined were prostitutes. 60% of all non-Chinese prostitutes were foreign born. So they were coming, like the more famous ones, which I'll get to the next slide, a lot of Irish. But the interesting thing, there were a lot of French prostitutes too, but they stayed in the hotels and operated out of there because they were considered a little more glamorous because they were French. But they operated mainly out of, it's now a bar, English pub there on 2nd Street, the Orleans Hotel. And then 80% of all prostitutes were foreign born. But a large percentage of the people that were here, particularly women at that time, were from outside of the United States. Here's a list of some of the more famous ones. Rosanna Hughes was from Ireland. She came here and she went right up to El Dorado Hills and she made a lot of money really quickly. Came back and bought a house here on 2nd Street in what is now Old Sacramento and set up business. She was very, very successful with what she did. And she ran a house of prostitution. And she married a gentleman that owned a bar, the Fashion Saloon. And they lived above the Fashion Saloon, but she ran that for years and made a lot of money. They were always trying to raid her place and catch her in the act. They were trying, because after 1854, after the 52 fire, they wanted to clean up the city and be respectable. They wanted to get rid of the rough and tumble gold rush days. And prostitution they saw as part of that. So they would station people outside of the windows of her house. And they would purposely just sit in there and play cards with the gentleman. And she didn't get arrested for that. The Frankie Bass was African-American woman. And I've never been able to find dates for her. She owned a house of prostitution on 2nd Street. A lot of it, at one time, there had to have been 8 or 9 houses of prostitution all along 2nd Street there. She actually took out insurance on her house, on her building. And when the 1852 fire happened, she was able to rebuild quickly and go right back into business. And all of these women married, all of them married. And then Mercedes Barriga, and then Josefa Cienfuegos, she is who's pictured right here. The interesting thing about all of them is they owned property, oftentimes property way outside of that first ward, and they were entrepreneurs. They were buying up. And one of them, we had the records of it, the Center for Sacramento History. She had bought up quite a bit of property, and when she died, she left it all to her nieces, okay? And her family from back east, when they found out how much she was worth, came out and contested the will, which they weren't able to. The nieces got to keep everything, which was really great. But I think it's important to understand how much they contributed economically to this region. They were houses of prostitution, but they supported the seamstresses. They supported the markets. Almost every business in town, they were putting money into, whether it was the women that worked there that were buying goods and services from them, or they were going out and buying buildings and then renting them back to normal citizens that weren't prostitutes. Then one of the things that's always struck me is women working with their husbands. So if you were married, you worked for your husband for free. Okay, you didn't get a salary or anything like that. You worked for them for free. Now, Margaret Frink, I love her. She came from, oh gosh, where did she come from? I'm trying to remember. Someplace in Indiana. She came from Indiana. And they came here in 1849. They were here really early. And her and her husband came across country. They were going to go gold pan up in the mountains. And when they got here, they just decided it wasn't worth it. And so they ended up opening up a restaurant. And they had a cow, so they had fresh milk, which was a novelty. And they used the dishes, the tin cups and plates that they brought with them. And as soon as men would walk in and see that there was a woman there, they would come in and sit down. Now, this is something that's repeated throughout in a number of businesses in San Francisco and around. If there was a woman in there, you were more likely to draw the men to come into your business than if it was an all-male business. And think about it, they wanted to see women. When there's only one woman for every 10 men, it was an anomaly to see women. And so it was really important for them to find them. Mary Eugenie Gregory, if you go down in Old Sac on J Street, I renamed the park there after her. And I did that very purposely. I had to go through, I didn't get to make the decision all on my own, but I had to put it in front of council and they voted on it. And she owned that property, the little park. It's a sunken park in there. And she actually had owned it. Her husband died. They came to California. They were in New Orleans. She was English, he was French. And they came, they were in New Orleans and they were in San Francisco, and then they came here and they opened up a business there on J Street. It was called Gregory Barnes, and they sold produce. And they were very successful at that. But her husband, she didn't know it, but he had a heart condition. And one day he was standing there and then he was down and he was gone. Her oldest daughter actually died from the exact same thing, just walking down the street. So it's a hereditary condition. But Mary, instead of going, oh God, what do I do? She had 5 children. She continued to run the business. She, like the ladies of the evening, bought up property. She built the building, the Hall and Lures building that is on 2nd Street. It's the big yellow building. And she rented it out to Hall and Lures. And she helped invest in refrigerated cars with the Transcontinental Railroad. So she was an innovator. And I felt it was time that we had a woman's name on something in Old Sacramento. It was great. So when you put this to council, they have to vote on it. And it's always, anybody have any comments? And my boss and I were sitting there and they go, there are 3 comments on that one. And we went, oh my God, somebody's mad about this. But it was all women saying it's about time something's named for a woman in this place. So this is something, how many of you have ever heard of soul traders? You have. Do you know what it is? So in the Soul Trader Act was put into place in 1852. And what it was is that allowed married women, this had nothing to do with single women, only married women, because married women were still considered property of their husbands. Remember I said that a married woman can't get paid outside her husband, she's unpaid labor. And so, but the problem that they were having here in California at that time because of the gold rush is there were a lot of deadbeat men and fathers and husbands, and they were drunks, they were gone a good portion of the time up in the gold fields, and these women, they didn't have any income. And so they passed this law because they basically didn't want women to go on the dole. They didn't want the state to have to support them. So the 1852 Soul Traders Act was passed, and it allowed married women all they had to do is write a letter, and they had to go in and submit it to the county. And we have, at the Center for Sacramento History, all these logbooks exist. And I have a picture next, and I'll show you. This is one of the logbooks. This is a page out of it. And this is Mary E. Gilbert. And in it, she describes how she is totally independent of her husband. He will have nothing to do with the business. And so you had to put this in, file it with the county, and then you had to post it 3 times in the newspaper that you were independent. And if you look at newspapers in the 1850s, you'll come across these quite a bit where the women are saying, this is my business, it's totally separate from my husband's. So the problem that I had is these women never used their first names. And a lot of times, even in the directories, they would refer to the business as the husband's instead of the wife's, even though she was a sole trader and legally had all the responsibility for the business. So, and you can see on the last one, it went from 1852 to 1858. As soon as they passed it in the legislature, they started arguing, going, these women are getting really uppity, and I don't want a woman changing my horse's shoes and things like that. And they said, that's just not right, and it shouldn't be, and they need to get back in home. And I have a friend who I always argue with him. I say, the gold rush was like war in a lot of ways. Women were really important. Think of World War II. Think of all the things women did to contribute to it. And they were necessary. I mean, and in World War I, women were the #1 draw to come in and be operators because their voices were easier to understand over the phones than men's. So women have played an essential role in wars. women played an essential role during the gold rush. They helped stabilize the communities. Brink, she established the Baptist church here in town. They were major, major community developers, but they weren't recognized as that. But the thing is, we want you there to do all this, and then we want you back in your place. And that's what happened in 1858, because they kept debating it back and forth in the legislature. I'm really comfortable with this. And there were too many women applying for it. So this is 2 pages out of 100 and more of people that applied every year. So hundreds of women were applying for this every year, until 1858, when they really made the laws stricter, and they said, and so it went from 80 to 100 women applying to 2 in 1 year, because they made it so restrictive. They made it so it limited women. The initial one limited women to a capital investment of $5,000, because we can't let the little ladies get in over their head. And then to get around this limit, they could testify that any money invested in the business over that sum had not come from their husbands. So they mainly saw these men as deadbeats, gamblers and so forth, that they felt would go out and use all that money. And then the women still wouldn't have anything. So they were trying to protect them. And then the other thing is, it's very clearly, they were solely responsible for the care of the children. So now they are the sole support, and not the husband is responsible for the children, but the wives. So that seems very equitable, don't you think? Okay, so the other one I want to talk about was single women and married women as independent businessmen. This is mainly single women that I'm talking about. And you may have seen this mural. I forget what street it's on. You can see, that's Lavinia Waterhouse. Any of you ever heard of Lavinia Waterhouse? She was awesome. She was so cool. She was a spiritualist, a businesswoman, a physician, a midwife. She believed in the water cure and had her own business. She was a suffragist, and she was a poet. She did it all. And she came here, she arrived in Sacramento in 1853 from Brooklyn, New York, with her husband, and he had tuberculosis, and they had 3 children. And they came here thinking that he could get better here because of the weather, which a lot of people came to California to get away from the weather and the cold winters and to deal with that. He didn't even survive a year here. And so there she was, a woman with 3 children, and she had to earn a living. And she opened up her water cure business. She also really, really focused her women on her business on women. She's never lost a single woman in birth, which is a higher success rate than almost any man can claim today. She was a midwife and an extremely successful one, but she worked with the women, and doctors at that time really didn't like treating women. I know we see the Westerns where it's call the doctor, he'll come in. They generally didn't touch women very much at that time. It was mainly, and women depended on midwives to deliver their babies. And if you were lucky to get her, you were very lucky. She was, and in the end, she moved to Monterey, and she died in 1880. But she had amassed a fair amount of money, and she gave all that money for a women's home to support women in their older age. So throughout her whole life, she was about women. She was a major suffragist. The other woman here, and you see her name on here, the other 2, Lucy P. Kreitz was also an independent businesswoman. I don't know as much about her, but Miss Lorinda Washburn is one of my favorites. She came here in 1852. She came with her brother. She was from New England. He did not like it here, but she loved it. And she never married. And she was this, the descriptions in the newspaper said she always wore calico dresses and straw hats. And the kids made fun of her because she was very tall and thin. And they would throw rocks at her when she walked down the street. When she died, because she was a seamstress, and she kept quietly putting away money, buying businesses. And I have this picture here because she owned this building right here. And that's on Front Street in Old Sacramento. But she owned property throughout Sacramento. And when she died, and they got to her will, they found out that she was worth over $1 million. That's then. Okay, the New York Times wrote her up as one of the wealthiest women in America. And nobody knew she had that much money. Nobody knew, because she didn't dress like it. She didn't do anything. But they were major suffragists, and they over and over again were fighting for the fact of taxation without representation. They were businesswomen, they were being taxed on a regular basis, and they had nothing to say about their government. And they were, excuse my language, they were pissed off. And so they wrote this to the tax collector of Sacramento County, and this was posted in the newspaper. Sir, we are native-born citizens of the United States of lawful age, entitled to all the rights and privileges of citizenship, and amenable to the laws, both state and national, notwithstanding which we are deprived by unjust discrimination of the right of suffrage, thereby subjecting us to the onerous oppression, burden of being taxed without representation, which is exactly what they complained about during the Revolutionary War, okay? A burden all more oppressive because enforced by physical power in an age and country which claims to be governed by the most enlightened principles of justice and equity. For these reasons, we offer our solemn protest against the collection of taxes on our property until such times as our rights as American citizens shall be secured and protected under the Constitution of the United States and this Commonwealth. We ask that you place this protest on file in the archives of this county. They put that in every newspaper in this region. When did this vote? This was 1890. They voted for suffrage in 1893. Did it pass? No. Do you know why? I can think of a couple. Well, the one thing that's really interesting is the vote passed in the rural areas. They all supported it. And that was, women had been having their own farms. They were part of the Grange societies. They were well established out there. But where it didn't pass was in the cities. Well, too many men, but too many men that wanted to drink. And it was the liquor lobbyists that said, no, they're going to pass prohibition if you put them in. And they did in the 1920s, so they were right. So this is kind of my closing. I'm going to wrap up here, but I was asked to do, the Society for California Pioneers invited me to come down, and they wanted to do an exhibit on their collections. And they said, come down, take a look, whatever you find, and tell us what you'd like to do. So I went down, and they kept pulling out stuff, and I was like, eh. And then they brought out these books, and they were, when you opened them up, they were this big. And they all started because of this lovely lady whose name was, well, which I had a long time finding her first name because nobody wanted to put it in the paper. It was Mrs. Virginia, or Noble Martin. Noble Martin was a state senator. And she had lived here in Sacramento for a number of years. But she actually came as Virginia Weir, and she arrived at Sutter's Fort on November 20th, 1849, and she was only 15 years old when she got here. She literally was one of those people that used dried apples to make pies and sell them. She really was one of them. And this was published as an editorial in 1900 in the San Francisco Chronicle. And she wrote in there, she said, what about the women? Why has there been no provision for pioneer mothers? And all that they were talking about in 1900 was, look at what the men did. Oh, we're so great. We built this state. Look at what we did. And she was ticked off. And she wrote that, and the newspaper got an onslaught of letters saying, yeah, what about the women? Let's pay attention to this. What about the women? And they reached out to her and said, we want our stories to be told. And they formed an organization. And they got these books, and they would have parties, and they would invite women to come and write down their stories. There's 3 books like that at the Society of California Pioneers, and you can go through and you can read all their stories in there. And so she was, now the other funny part about this was the pioneers had only gotten that about 2 years earlier. And they said some guy showed up and knocked on their door, and he said, my aunt wanted me to give you guys all this stuff. And it was in a trunk. And they didn't know what it was. And then here it was all of this. But so what I wanted to do is I wanted to say to Virginia, because we have an opportunity, as we talk about these women, we validate who they were and their lives. We're experiencing critical thinking, we're having empathy, and we're learning what it would be like to have lived in those times. So let's all give a handshake and applause for Mrs. Noble Martin. Questions? No, I didn't point at you. That's the person behind you. No. Wait, we need microphones going. Right there. Where?
It's already turned on. Yeah, I really liked everything he said. I was wondering about the absence of Mammy Pleasant. Are you familiar with?
Yes, I am. This was mainly focused in Sacramento.
Oh, I see.
So that's why you're getting what you're getting. And so Mammy Pleasance wasn't here.
Yeah.
So that's why she wasn't included in this.
I just might mention.
Whoa.
Because people online.
No, the rules.
Sorry. I just might mention that the Sacramento History Museum is sponsoring a play on her March 18th.
Who?
Of Pleasance.
Oh, okay.
Of Mary Pleasance, who's got to be one of the most interesting human beings that ever walked into California. Mm-hmm. And that's not an overstatement. It's an understatement. And it's March 18th. It's only one night, 100 seats. So I'm sure it's going to fill out. And sorry to plug here, but Cook's Tour is got an event going there, and I'm actually heading it. So if you're interested, let me know. And that's it. So one of the things, and one of my friends, a friend of mine who used to teach at Hayward State, now it's called some East Bay, he said, I was at a conference with him, and he said, if you came to California during the gold rush, you were a gambler and you had a big personality. So there's a lot of people that the more I learn, the more and nothing against Mammy Pleasance, but there are extraordinary people that came here and shaped the world and the state that we live in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I had a question about the soul traders and what happened to the women who became soul traders between 1852 and 1858. Once the law was changed, were they penalized by the change in law?
A number of them, and as you go through the books, a large percentage of them were farmers, and they maintained their farms. When I was going through directories trying to track women, a lot of these women only stayed in business for a year or two. Typically, that was what I found because it was tough. And one of the things that happened is once the Transcontinental Railroad came through, the state really started to become more industrialized and big business started coming in. So these small business entrepreneurs, which a lot of these soul traders were really pushed out of business by larger companies. Like even Hopkins was a big company of, in the Big Four, and he had money and they would push the smaller businesses out. So it really was a short period of time where women had an opportunity to make money as boarding houses and so forth. And then once it became more industrialized and there was more money coming in, then they were pushed out of business, and it was all bigger businesses that came in.
Any other questions? Anything online?
No. I'm supposed to tell Marcia that there are 40 people watching online.
Oh, hello. Hello. Nobody else?
They'll be available to us too.
Probably Monday morning.
Okay, I'm going to say one more political thing. So right now, our National Park Service is under fire. And they are limiting hours of just a couple days a week for any site that is dedicated to women or people of color. Whereas traditional sites that are about men, white men, are open 7 days a week. All of us need to call. I don't care. Everybody says, oh, California, our senators are liberal. It counts when you call, when you complain and you say, our parks are sacred. Stop it. Stop it. I was in a presentation, and the woman that was giving it, I asked if she could share her slides with me, and she said no. She goes, I could lose my job if this got out. And she said, talk about it, but don't say my name. And because they are firing people right and left. And we have a right to have our history told from all perspectives, but please understand that it is under fire right now. And particularly, we just went through a whole thing with Clara Barton, where our group was able to fight to save it so it's staying open, but they were going to close it down, her site, because she was a woman and nobody really cared and nobody really knew what she did. Yeah, and everybody goes, well, she was a nurse. And I was like, she was so much more than that. All these women that I just presented to you, they were so much more than that. And the men are too. I don't want to be totally sexist about this, but there are so many stories out there that are not going to be told. I mean, you probably all heard what happened in Philadelphia, where they took down anything that had to do with George Washington's slaves. It's back up. The court said you can't do that. But let's think about that, folks. Do we want people telling us what we can see and what we cannot see? Okay. So one of the things that the most effective way to come back at this, and this is what the National Park Service told us, that most of our congressmen and senators like the national parks. And if you call and complain to them that you feel that they're under threat, because they will do something about it. But you have to hound them. And so they get 100 calls a day about it. That makes a difference because they keep those tallies. So yes, call, write, tell them to leave our Park Service alone and that to stop interfering. But one of the women in my group works at Ellis Island, and they are covering up things, and it just makes me so angry to think about. They're forced to send their text to the White House to get it approved for labels for exhibits. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. That is controlling our thoughts. That's not right. We have to have broader perspectives. And I know a couple of people that have been fired because they refuse to do that. So just be very vocal and realize that this is an important part of who we are. That's why I had that slide at the very beginning. That's why history is important. The more we know about it, and the better our democracy can be. She wrote the book Cast. And at the beginning, she said, Isabel Wilkerson, who she wrote this. Anyway, in the book, she said, democracy is like an old house. If you don't work at it every single day, it's going to fall apart. And I think we have to work at it every single day.
Just as an aside, I know you mentioned back. Just an aside, Muir Woods has had everything removed about Native Americans and women in our backyard. It's
right.
Not just
oh no, it's all over the United States. And they took down, there's a really famous image of a slave, and it's his back, and you can see the whip marks on it. And they forced them to cover that up. And so there are places where all of those things are covered up, and it's just wrong.
And this, can you hear me? This too is like a war. After World War II, the valuables, the history, the paintings came back out of hiding. And nowadays, a lot of people have information digitally that'll be preserved. And at some point, but it's going to be a long time from now, things will start to reemerge and be mostly available again.
But a lot of things are still being taken down.
I know.
Right at the end of Biden's administration, he passed an executive order to make history in our national parks to have a broader perspective. And he commissioned various studies, and one of them was on women. And I was one of the women that wrote that, presented to our group. And they had posted their finished product online where they were supposed to. And only a few weeks after Trump was president, it was all taken down. Now, I still have it because she distributed it to us. Yes, and the point is, we have to do that. I was telling in my group, there's a book by John Steinbeck called The Moon is Down. Have you ever read that? Such a great book. But that book was passed around all throughout Europe during World War II in order to inspire people. And we can do the same thing. We have to keep these things out there. We have to keep doing that.
Will you be giving other lectures?
Not at this point. Nobody's asked me. So not at this point. You can talk to my friends that are here. They'll say, no, she shouldn't do it anymore. And then my business partnership, where's Alita? There she is. This is what we are consultants now. We're Eymann and Bray and Associates. So if you need a museum consultant, give us a call. Thank you.
That's really eye-opening. Why didn't we know this detail before? I think we knew some of it, but thank you so much for sharing the rest of the story.